Hi guys, this is Dr. Momsilovich with your lecture 14.2 on Conservation Biology. When we're talking about conservation, we're talking about conserving biodiversity. There's a few different ways that we can define biodiversity. The most common definition is species diversity, which you guys have already learned about a bit. So species diversity is the number of different species that occur in a particular location. And the number of species varies depending on the location that you're interested in. So just for an example, the island of Madagascar has over 1,300 different species of ants, whereas the entire country of Canada only has 131 species of ants. There's large differences in the biodiversity of ants between those two locations for various reasons. So Madagascar is a tropical biome, which means that it would tend to have more species in general. And the reasons for that we've discussed. And Canada has fewer. It's further north. It has a shorter warm season when the ants would be active, things like that. And it's important for conservation biologists to know this information because if you're trying to work on conservation of a species or of a group, it's important to know how many of that species or how many different types of that organism should be there. So trying to save 1,300 species of ants is a lot different than trying to save 131 species of ants. So it's important to know the biodiversity that should be occurring in any particular area. Other types of biodiversity are genetic diversity. So this is where you have a species and that species either has many alleles for each gene, or you could have a species with only one allele for a specific gene, meaning that that gene is fixed and every individual in that species has the same gene. You could have a genus with many different species in it. That would be another example of genetic diversity. A loss of genetic diversity would mean that there is a lower ability for that organism to adapt, especially to a changing environment. This is particularly important because if we have populations that have very low numbers of individuals, those individuals and that population over time are going to have a harder time adapting to the environment because they won't have the genetic diversity where some of the individuals would have genes that would allow them to survive and reproduce in that changing environment. Chemical diversity is another type of biodiversity, and it's related to genetic diversity. So this would be a type of diversity that's related to the proteins that are made from genes. The more different genes you have, the more gene products and chemical pathways that are possible. This is actually important and useful for humans because a lot of the medications that humans use come from chemicals and other things that are derived from plants in tropical rainforests, and a lot of new medications that are being discovered are from those places as well. So if we lose that plant diversity, we're losing that diverse repository of different genetics and chemicals that can be actually used for our benefit. Another type of biodiversity is ecosystem diversity. This is where you have the number of different ecosystems on the planet, so think biomes in this case. So we're talking then about we are losing or destroying the integrity of an ecosystem, and that means losing organisms that have adapted to particular species interactions and abiotic conditions over tens of thousands to millions of years. An example of an ecosystem that is currently at risk would be prairies in North America. The prairies have soil and occur in climatic conditions that are very beneficial for plants to grow in. And so most of them have been converted to farmland because of that. So that is an entire ecosystem that is currently at risk of extinction. So why is biodiversity important, and why should we care about maintaining and conserving biodiversity? There's a few different reasons why biodiversity is important, not just for people, but for the health of the entire planet. The first reason is ecosystem services, which we talked a bit about in the last lecture. So this would be the fact that our planet provides us with clean air, water, soil, pollination of flowers and crops and things like that. So just the normal functions of the planet are actually vital for the health of people and the health of everything else. It's a big interconnected web. Another reason is biological resources, so food, medicine, future resources that we haven't even discovered yet, wood products, things like that. Those are all important parts of daily life for people, and so it's very important to conserve and maintain those. There's also social benefits of biodiversity. So we enjoy natural places that are diverse for recreation. They have cultural value depending on your culture and where you're from. And they're also important for research and education. So I've touched on the fact that a lot of drugs come from tropical regions. And so just to give you an example, the antiviral drug Tamiflu that's used to treat the flu, if you were to get that, it's a recently developed drug, is made from shikimic acid that comes from star anise. And star anise is a plant that comes from the tropical regions of Vietnam and China. So if those tropical regions were no longer in existence, that would be something that we would not have been able to find and use to produce a drug that can help reduce the longevity and the symptoms of someone who gets the flu. So what are the major threats to biodiversity? There's quite a lot of them, but the most important and the one that causes the most biodiversity loss is generally considered habitat loss. So if you look in the picture in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, you can see an area that from 2001 to 2016 is gradually becoming less and less of a forest ecosystem and becoming more fragmented and more urbanized. When you lose that habitat, you're losing the species that live there as well. And so human activities and desertification and things like that are generally considered to be the most significant threat to biodiversity. The second would be invasive species. So this would be another human activity. So intentionally or unintentionally introducing species that are not native to areas can have a drastic effect. So invasive species are able to thrive because they have no natural predators, and the organisms that they're being introduced to don't know how to protect themselves against that invasive species. And so a lot of the time, invasive species are able to essentially take over a new ecosystem and outcompete and kill off other species that live there. Overharvesting is a concern when we're talking about fish, trees. It can be a concern for just about anything that humans use for their own purposes and their own consumption. Fish in particular is a concern because when you go fishing, what do you want to get the biggest fish possible, obviously. The problem with that is that a lot of fish species don't start reproducing until they reach a certain size. And the larger that a fish is, the more eggs that those fish produce. And so when you're taking the larger individuals out of the ecosystem, you're actually hurting the ability of that species to have enough individuals to reproduce and fill in the gaps for the ones that have been removed. And it takes those species quite a long time to get to a point that they are able to reproduce. The same is true for a lot of tree species. So a lot of trees, to get to their height that is suitable for logging and things like that, some of them can take 20 to 50 years. And so when you cut a tree down, you're taking something out of that ecosystem that can take decades to replace. Pollution is another issue, and this sort of ties in with habitat loss. So pollution releases not only the physical pollutants, but as they break down chemicals and other things into the ecosystem that can be harmful and can affect species. So it's not just when we think about like sea turtles and things getting the rings from soda cans wrapped around their necks and things like that. It's actually that, as well as the chemicals and other things can actually be toxic and kill things that live in those ecosystems. Another major threat to biodiversity that is arguably possibly the most important current threat is climate change. So as climate is changing around the planet, most areas are getting hotter, and a lot of species have very specific temperatures in which they can survive. And as the earth gets hotter and hotter, you're getting to a point where species simply can't survive and they're trying to move their ranges, which then puts them in conflict with other species that they wouldn't normally be around. And you also have issues where species are changing when they're active. So plants and things are flowering at different times because of the weather changes. Insects are becoming active at different times. And so you now have an issue where you have plants and their pollinators that are not active at the same time during pollination seasons, and that's causing issues as well. So what is the possible end result of not preserving biodiversity? Well, that would be extinction. So extinction is a natural part of microevolution. So that's not something that we've talked about in the past, that extinction is actually an important part of the evolution of new species, but it actually is. So we need things to go extinct to open up niches and things within an environment and allow new organisms to evolve and to speciate. So there is normal extinction rate, but right now we're in a situation where the extinction rate is 100 to 1,000 times higher than normal background rates. We know that we're 100 to 1,000 times higher because of modeling and historical records and things like that. So we know that the extinction rate that's currently in progress is a lot higher. There have been 5 mass extinctions in the history of the Earth. So, for example, you have the asteroid impact that changed the climate of the Earth and killed off all of the dinosaurs. All of the previous extinctions were due to natural occurrences, such as that asteroid hitting the Earth. We're currently in the middle of the 6th mass extinction, called the Holocene extinction. This one is different because it's caused by human activities. And so it's those activities of humans, habitat loss, and pollution and climate change that are causing all of these species to become endangered and go extinct. So currently there are over 60 species just of mammals that are considered critically endangered, which means that they're near extinct. So these are things like gorillas and lemurs and rhinos, different species of them, vaquitas, red wolves, pangolins, Sumatran elephants, pygmy three-toed sloths, saiga, bongos, giant sable antelopes. And what that means is that those species are so critically endangered that it's going to be nearly impossible for their numbers to come back. And that means that your children or grandchildren will only know about these species through reading about them. They'll never be able to see any of these individuals in real life. And so this would be something like, for us, marsupial carnivores that went extinct in 1936. So these are no longer on the planet, and we only can learn about them from historical counts. There are several local, national, and global conservation efforts that are currently in effect to try to reduce the amount of biodiversity loss and reduce the amount of harm that humans are doing to the planet. So legislation is important because of this idea called the tragedy of the commons. So this is an idea that when you have a shared resource, people are going to use that resource in a selfish way to try to maximize it for themselves. And they will do that to the point that the commons fails because of that selfish behavior. So this would be something like global ocean fisheries, where no one nation is really in charge of the oceans, and so countries will overfish and take lots of fish from those resources, and there's no way to legislate that and to make sure that the fish are not being over-harvested. There's been some legislation like the Endangered Species Act, which is in the United States, that makes rules on how the habitats where endangered species live can be used and have to be preserved. That you can't kill endangered species and things like that. And there's very strict regulations on those things, and that has helped quite a bit for some species to keep them from going extinct. There's what we call the CITES, which is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. This is an international treaty that keeps, or that many nations have agreed on, that makes it so that it's illegal to trade either the parts or any or live individuals of species that are on their list of protected species. We're currently working on, and hopefully we'll find some common ground soon on global regulations for using fossil fuels and things like that. So that we can start reducing our carbon emissions. There's also preservation of habitat and state and national parks, where those areas will be preserved so that they cannot be used for human purposes other than just enjoying them. And there's also societies like the Audubon Society and the Nature Conservancy that protect certain areas and different species and advocate for them. There are captive breeding programs at zoos and wildlife parks and aquariums where different individuals will, different species will be bred captively with the hope of releasing them into the wild so that we can bring some of their numbers back up. Some species do better in captive breeding programs than others. So large things like carnivores and things like that tend not to do as well with with captive breeding and release programs, because they aren't learning those natural behaviors of being a predator in captivity. Other species like birds, amphibians, reptiles, things like that tend to do better with being released into the wild. So there are some limitations to captive breeding. So when we're looking at species that are at risk of extinction, we generally see them in this pattern that we call an extinction vortex. An extinction vortex is where you have a small population, and because that population is small, you have individuals that have to mate with members of that they're closely related to, which is inbreeding. And you also have those populations that are subject to genetic drift because they are small, and that leads to a loss of genetic variability. The loss of genetic variability then leads to a reduction in individual fitness and population adaptability, which leads to lower reproduction and higher mortality. And eventually, this leads to a smaller population, and eventually it's a continuous cycle downwards until you get to a point where that species goes extinct. And because there's not enough variability and not enough individuals anymore to maintain that population. In conservation biology, there is a tool that's used to determine the likelihood of a species going extinct. This is called a population viability analysis, or PVA. This is a species-specific method of risk assessment that conservation biologists use, which means that for every individual species, there's a different population viability analysis assessment that's done to determine that particular population or species likelihood of extinction. So it indicates the urgency of recovery efforts. So it indicates how likely and how quickly a species might go extinct. And it identifies the key life stages or processes that should be the focus of recovery efforts. So if it's that we need to protect larger fish because those are the ones that are contributing the most offspring to the population, then those are the ones that the analysis will indicate need our protection more than the younger fish. So there's several steps in this. So you would collect data, identify your problem and list your options, then determine or modify the model structure. You then estimate or refine parameters. You estimate parameters that you don't have data for. Then you build or improve your model. You assess the extinction risk and recovery chances, and then you perform a sensitivity analysis, which shows if your model is particularly sensitive to a particular type of change or perturbation. Then you kind of go through those steps again until you're able to know that your model is good and strong. And then you rank your options, you select the best management plan for that particular species, you implement the management plan, and you monitor the species in a long-term way, and you evaluate the data from the monitoring, and then you remake your model if that's necessary. So the goal of conservation is to have you be able to do what you do forever. So any activity that you do should be sustainable in the long term. And there's 5 different goals within that. So the transition from fossil fuels would be the most important. So we're looking for energy sources that have 0 emissions and are renewable. We want to reduce the impact on the land, so some more selective use of land instead of building things and using land for human purposes regardless of the species that live there. The third would be return the ocean to good health and use it sustainably. So stop overfishing, stop dumping pollution and garbage and things like that into our oceans. Eliminate waste. So that one I think is pretty self-explanatory. And reimagine success. So reconcile growth and contentment. So not necessarily always strive for growth within your economy and society, but instead try to find a way that people can be happy with where they are instead of continually looking for a better and better life. So on the last slide of your slides, there is this video. It's about 38 minutes long, but it's sort of a positive overarching theme that's optimistic about it's business positive, human positive, and nature positive. So I would like you to go back and watch that. And that's all we have for this lecture.